to NJ Law, the program designed to inform and educate you about the inner workings of our criminal justice system, allowing you to speak directly to New Jersey law enforcement officials who make the decisions in our two-county area. Your host, Detective Sgt Kevin Quinn of the Township of Ocean Police Department, is an 11-year veteran police officer. He has taught at the Monmouth County Police Academy and has lectured at Monmouth College and Brookdale College.
Good evening. I'm Sgt Kevin Quinn of the Township of Ocean Police, your host for NJ Law. Welcome, and I'd like to welcome my two guests who took time out to come down and be with us and talk to you via telephone or via live line. Senator Joseph Palaia from the 11th District, who also was a past councilman and mayor of Ocean Township where I work, so it was good I had John. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And right to his left, my right, and your right, is Daniel Jacobsen, an assemblyman also from the 11th District, whose home port is Ocean Township and is a present councilman, although I understand you're not running for re-election there, but you're going to devote all your time to Assembly. Thank you both for coming. What we want to discuss this evening is basically how the Assembly and the legislature and law enforcement work sometimes hand in hand and sometimes not so hand in hand, bringing you any legal laws and new bills that might come along that might be of benefit to the community at large. I think I'm going to start with Senator Palaia in his role as teacher, which he's well familiar with, maybe to give us a short overview of basically what it takes to get a law passed.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I think what many people don't understand is that over 90% of the laws that are initiated begin with somebody in the public coming to us as legislators and saying, I have a problem, or my special interest group has a problem, what can we do? And the way I handle that, and I think most legislators do, we take their concept and send it to Trenton to the Office of Legislative Services, a bipartisan commission there, and they draft a potential piece of legislation for us. Mm-hmm. I then take it back to the people who requested it and ask if this is what they are looking for. And if it is, and it's what they want, then I send it back to the Office of Legislative Services. They do a final draft, they send it to me. Then it starts the legislative process where you introduce it, it gets a number, it's posted in committee, that's your first step. You then have it go to the floor of your House, in my case the Senate, and then you have to run the same process back over in the other House, the Assembly. So the basic premise is it's not easy to get a law passed. There are, I think, about over 9,000 bills introduced in the hopper, they say. But of that 9,000, I don't think there are 200 or 300 ever become law. Mm-hmm. But you have to be aware of all those bills being proposed. But people don't realize it starts initially with the general public themselves telling us.
Now, if I contact you and I want to get whatever bill passed, let's say a piece of environmental legislation, you said you bring it first to Legislative Services?
Office of Legislative Services.
And are they basically your language people?
They're the language people, but they also will check it out to see if it's constitutionally sound, or if there's not any duplication of somebody already put in a bill that does the same thing. So they do a lot of that checking for you. You can introduce bills, and in fact, Dan and I and his running mate, John Villapiano, we sometimes put in the same bill that's in the best interest of our district, and we run it concurrently through our houses, and that way it moves a lot quicker. Like we're working on a bill in Ocean Grove right now about the deinstitutionalized, and we're running those bills concurrently right now.
Yes, and we should talk about that a little bit too, as far as once it gets through the Senate and it has to go through the Assembly, and now...
Well, it's a numbers game,
okay.
Kevin. It's what the numbers game is: 41, 21, and 1. It takes 41 to pass anything in Assemblyman Jacobsen's house, because you have 40 legislative districts, 2 individuals from each who represent the Assembly. That's 80. A simple majority is 41. In my house is 40 districts, 1 senator, that's 40. Simple majority is 21. And the 1 is the governor. Right. You see, so it's 41, 21, and 1. He can do one of 3 things. He can sign a bill, of which he has 45 days to do that. He can CV or conditionally veto the bill, which says, in effect, I agree with it, but there's some technicalities, and then he sends it back to the sponsor, or he can absolutely veto the bill. So he has 3 options to do it.
Now, if maybe you could explain too, and I'm going to give Dan an opportunity. You're a state senator. Now, what's the difference between you and the Dan Jacobsen?
Basically, very little. So he even started with the salaries. You know, everything is the same. Our legislative offices. The basic thing that you really do is you have to approve of all the governor's appointments, the judiciary and different appointments to the commissions. The Senate does that, and the Assembly doesn't. But beside that, there is really, I haven't seen any difference that maybe Dan has in his first term up there.
Dan, what do you? Are they more rambunctious in the Assembly?
Yeah, I think we tend to be a little more rambunctious.
Oh, absolutely.
In the Assembly, definitely.
Yeah.
It's certainly a much more, I think, colorful place than the Senate. I guess, Joe, you know that. You served.
Well, there's twice as many egos over there. There's only 80. There's 80 of them, only 40 of us.
But they're twice as large as the Senate, so it evens out.
Yeah.
But there are some other important features of the New Jersey state government which are a little different than other governments in the state. Under our Constitution, which was developed really in 1947, so it's a fairly new Constitution. The chief executive, our governor, is probably one of the strongest in the nation in the powers that he's given. For example, Joe outlined the conditional veto power, which very few governors have, and he also has what's called the line item veto. He can go through the budget, and any line item that could be as small as $5,000, $10,000,
right.
He can say that's out, and it takes a 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature to override that, which is very, very uncommon. So that gives him some really extraordinary powers. In addition, another important aspect of our state government is that if you notice in other states there's a lot of statewide elected officials. A lot of times there's an attorney general elected statewide. In some states there's a commissioner of agriculture. In New Jersey, the governor appoints all the cabinet officials, which concentrates even more power in his hands. And I guess the reason that the Constitutional Convention, which convened in New Brunswick in 1947, decided to do that was because the old system of government, the power was very much diffused, and it was very inefficient, and it was very ineffective. So in New Jersey, the bottom line is you have a very, very strong chief executive with very few other statewide officials, and those various features he has in dealing with the legislature. And that also makes our Speaker of the Assembly and our Senate President very powerful figures, much more powerful than in other states, because again, there's no other statewide elected officials with a statewide base. So you really have a governor, a speaker, and a Senate President with a lot of interplay between the 3 of them.
You have to understand, too, if something happens with the governor, if he's out of the state, just out of the state, not out of the country, the Senate President takes over for him. And if they're both out, the Speaker of the Assembly takes over as the chief executive during that time. So they're powerful positions.
So you wouldn't have like Alexander Haig saying, I'm in charge.
Well, he could say, but he wouldn't be.
He'd have to be the Senate President.
Yeah.
You mentioned a conditional veto and a line item veto. Maybe you could explain to the folks exactly what we're talking about. Now, a line item veto, you're saying if the governor
in the budget, when they're doing the budgetary
if he pulls
process.
a piece out, then that doesn't invalidate the rest of the budget
Right.
necessarily.
In other words, when you go through the state budget, very similarly, same thing in the federal budget, but the president doesn't have this power, which is a shame. He really should. But it's actually line by line, various items of spending, and they get very, very specific. I remember several years ago, I guess back, I used to be an aide to Frank Pallone when he was in the state Senate. There was a controversy over a line item for Deal Lake in Ocean Township. I think it was a $400,000 line item that was vetoed by then Governor Kane and was reinstated. But even it could be even less than $400,000. You can insert a line item, as I said, for $10,000, $15,000 for something, and the governor could, as he's looking through the whole state budget, can say, no, that's out, that's out, that's out. And it's very hard for the legislature to put that back. The reason why that's advantageous is because, for example, when the president gets a budget from the Congress, he gets these very large chunks of spending proposals, and it's an all or nothing proposition. So there's so many things he'll want, there's so many things he won't want that are wasteful, and he's going to have to make one decision, and he's stuck with a lot of spending he doesn't want. In New Jersey, the governor has the liberty of just knocking out that little spending that he doesn't want.
At the federal level,
he doesn't have that opportunity.
Sometimes they hide stuff in a
yeah, for example, you could have a large, what's called omnibus bill, and it could have many facets to it, and there might be $15,000 for I don't know what the figure was, there was something for a Lawrence Welk Museum recently out in the Midwest in some large bill. Well, obviously, if you had the power to line item veto and you were the president, I would hope you'd knock out the Lawrence Welk Museum in Kansas or whatever state it was in.
Not that you don't like Lawrence Welk.
I'm not too big on Lawrence Welk, but that's besides the point. But it obviously doesn't merit that type of spending of taxpayers' dollars. But the president then has to accept what might be a $30, $40 billion spending bill with needed appropriations and have $15,000 in there for all the various Lawrence Welk museums, so to speak. The governor of the state of New Jersey doesn't have that problem, and he can knock those items out. And the conditional veto also is very good, too, because what will happen is there could be a proposal, and he could say, well, look, I don't want this proposal, but I'm willing to compromise, I'm willing to change it. Here's the changes. Simply pass it by a simple majority, and the proposal will become law. And I think the effect of that is it makes the government work much more efficiently and much more effectively and gives a little more flexibility to the elected officials.
There's one other thing about the budget in the state of New Jersey. Our budget has to be balanced. It's not like the federal budget. You know, they could just keep spending. We can't. Our budget has to be balanced. So what the governor usually says, he makes his proposal first. He has a state of the budget message, and he says, here's the challenge. Legislators, now you go to it, and we have a Senate Appropriation Committee and an Assembly Appropriations Committee, and I think sometimes they act as a joint Appropriations Committee, and they review his budget. And invariably, he will say, hey, that's fine, you want to add a program, where's the money coming from? So we have to have a balanced budget in the state of New Jersey.
And that's an excellent point about a feature of our state government versus the federal government, which most people are used to. When you have a balanced budget amendment, balanced budget provision in your Constitution, and when you have a line item veto, there are some very strict fiscal controls. Other states don't have that. For example, New York State does not have a balanced budget constitutional requirement. Consequently, they will go into debt and borrow, and you'll have to pay interest into the future. We can't do that in New Jersey. And the reason that's important, sure, the federal government can do it. They have power over the monetary system. They can adjust the interest rates, the money supply, et cetera. But when you're a state government, a small player in the national economy, if you just start basically taking your debt and borrowing for it and just incurring all these large interest charges, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. And New York has that problem. Massachusetts really has that problem very severely now.
It can be a problem. What I wanted to do is just take a second and remind our viewers at home, our phone number here in the studio is 681-3330. That's 681-3330. If you have a question for myself or either of these gentlemen, pick up your phone. This is interactive TV, and you can certainly express your opinion as long as you keep it clean, and possibly bring something to these gentlemen' attention that might desire their attention. Let me speak a little bit about some of the laws, because there's a ton of them, and
too many.
Thank you.
There are. There are too many. Absolutely.
Well, back when, not too long after I became a policeman, several years, they changed the criminal code, and they brought it to 2C, and before that we had a lot of common law crimes and things that weren't specifically designated or weren't spelled out in the law, and they were, which was a task in and of itself. Do you find that there's a lot of time when you personally get involved in criminal law? Now, Senator, you come from an education background,
right,
being an educator all your life, and Dan, you're from a legal background, so that's an interesting mix. In other words, we're not all made up of attorneys out in the State House, and I guess that's good, isn't it?
Well, I think it's good. It's really good to have the diversification in the State House, and we have to rely on people with the expertise in the field, and you have to do a lot of studying and a lot of reading on your own to catch up, to find out what that bill is all about. It's it's not an easy process, but you can do it. You can work it out. And true, the criminal code you're talking about is very important, and maybe I don't know how that criminal code works, but I know enough that when that bill comes up for a vote of how it's going to affect basically my constituency and whether I think it's in their best interest.
I think the legal background is a tremendous advantage, and of course in the legislature where you have a collection of individuals representing the people, and I think the state legislature in New Jersey, in terms of where the people come from and the different characteristics they embody, is very representative of the state as a whole. So it's good to have lawyers, it's good to have educators, it's good to have small businessmen. My partner in the Assembly, John Villapiano, is a businessman, a small businessman, and it's a nice mix. And I have I think I'm very fortunate to have the legal background because it's really I've used it quite a bit. Although I've been in for a year, the big issues haven't really involved the criminal code. It's been more about education and fiscal issues. But when we got into the battle about the school funding, for example, that was very much connected to a Supreme Court decision. The strategy on how to deal with the school funding issue, particularly after some of us decided to challenge the Democratic leadership on the issue, I used my legal background extensively because I had to know exactly what we can do and what would be allowed and what the best responses were. And I'm really glad I had it because it really came in good use.
By the same token, I'm sure when the education bills come up,
sure.
you get all fired up.
Yeah, come to think, I've been fired up for about 16 months now, ever since they started talking about QEA and everything. But Dan alluded to the Supreme Court, ruling, and it does take a legal mind, but a lot of times you can look into it yourself and know what you feel that should be done, and then that's what you bring out in your discussions on the floor of the Senate. You have to keep something in mind, too, that previously, years and years ago, there were many lawyers in both houses. Because nobody else could get away and do it and all that. It's evolved quite differently now, and Dan is right. There is a mixture there now. We run from funeral directors to really. We run the gambit over there, and everybody has their own little expertise that you have to listen to what they're saying.
Well, I think that makes it makes a lot of sense. It's probably why maybe our state system works a little better than others, because we have that diversification of people from all walks of life in there. What I'm interested in, and Dan, you kind of alluded to it, you said, well, we're not passing that many bills that have to do with, let's say, 2C now, and granted, don't you find that a lot of the other bills meld with all that, and without getting too far afield? I think, personally, I think education, when we have a recession, when the education system doesn't work, if the schools aren't working, if they're kicking people out too soon that don't have basic skills, they become, unfortunately, our problems later. How strong is that feeling as far as, let's just take education. Are there things that are going on in education now that you feel so strongly about that we're going to be in big trouble if we don't do something about them in the near future?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I could go on for about 10 days. Because right now, I have to tell you something, Kevin. And after my 33 years in school and over 40 years dealing with the educational system, I'm extremely concerned, very concerned with what's happening in our educational system right now in the state of New Jersey. I really am, and it's bothering me no end, because I think eventually it's affecting the very character of our democracy, and that's our educational system. It's affecting it right now, and I don't feel that our children are going to be given the programs and the teachers to do the job. They're not going to have them after a year or so, and that bothers me tremendously. One of the things you have to realize, when we pass laws, a lot of times they're placed into a department of some kind, and they sort of get lost in the rules and regs under the criminal code that you're talking about. So a lot of times we lose where that bill is going.
Sure. And
it's difficult to stay on top of that all the time. Most of us do follow a bill through to see where it's going and what's happening to it after we give the guidelines, it goes to the DEP or what have you. It's not an easy system, but it does work. Believe me, the checks and balances are there. The bottom line is, I'm very worried about our educational system right as it stands now in the state of New Jersey. I don't see any leadership coming out of our Department of Education whatsoever. I think Dr. John Ellis has got to take the bull by the horns and make some tough decisions, but I don't see it right now happening.
We see it all over the place. We even see it in Ocean Township, a fairly I guess, I don't know whether you call us affluent, but we've always seemed to have all the programs that we needed to have.
Academically very sound.
And I've seen in the last several years, because I was closely, or I worked closely with the school people, went in and taught some classes and things, that I think it was a year later I went back to see if we could do the same thing, and that program, those teachers were gone.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very important to teach people not just how to read, write, and add and subtract, but also how to deal with life's problems. And if they can't, I strongly feel that then they become a problem to society, even sometimes when they don't want to be. I don't know, Dan, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to add, there's some other problems with all this, and there's a big issue of whether government can solve all the problems. When you grapple with education policy, and I'm much more, it's much more newer. It's newer to me than it is to Joe. Obviously, Joe was. I'm proud to say my former principal in first and second grade in
I learned him
school.
good.
Except for the political party, we disagree on that. But outside of that, the problem is that I just went to my 10th high school reunion last summer, so I haven't been out of high school for that long, and yet when I talk to my friends who are now teachers about the problems they face in the high schools and the disciplinary problems and the drug problems, it's definitely getting worse, and they're really getting to be very, very difficult places to teach kids. So the question is, with the decline of the family system, in some areas of the state, the school really is the only stable institution in a child's life, particularly in some of the inner cities and the poorer cities. The question that I seem to be grappling with, that I'm picking up that everyone's grappling with, is what really is the role of our schools now?
Yeah.
Are they to be the institution that actually takes care and raises the kids? Or are they to continue in their traditional role as a supplement of the family? And it has to do with the family. And you hear a lot of conflicting things. You hear a lot of people arguing, it doesn't make a difference what you do. You can spend as much money as you want. But unless there's a family structure behind the child, you're never going to give that child a proper education. On the other hand, you'll hear other people who are arguing for better programs saying that, this is the only thing that a lot of these kids have, and if we fail them here, we've lost them for good because they don't have a family structure, and that's the reality. And the challenge for legislators such as us is to strike that balance somewhere, because I think there's merits in both arguments. And then, of course, you come into the fiscal considerations, the tight economic times we're in, and you have very, very difficult decisions to make. And Joe and I'll agree, some of the decisions that have made in the past recently in the state, I've disagreed with, even though it caused some disagreements with my party, and Joe and I have been in agreement on a lot of them, that they were not decisions in the best interest of the education system.
I wanted to play off something Dan said, and that one of the things that I found in my 27 years as a school principal is parental involvement. The parents are part of that educational family. It starts with the board, the administration, the teachers, the students, but the key to that whole thing is parental involvement. You can have a teacher teach the greatest 6 hours of lessons that you'd ever want to see in your life, classic, and could go home into an environment that's upsetting to the child, and in 6 minutes, those 6 hours can be undone with abusive parents, drug, alcohol, what have you. So unless we bring them more into the school, you're spinning your wheels. We've got to get parents involved, because you can't be doing a good job here and have it undone over here. And to me, that's very important.
Do you find that, I guess what you're saying is, unfortunately, and I see it, that more and more people are turning the bringing up of their children over to the state and saying, okay, here's the problem, fix it, fix this. And for a long time, I think we did that. I think we did have such a glut of programs, and okay, if this is wrong, we have, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have the programs, but it was usually send them to us, and then there went little Johnny over to that program, and mom and dad stayed home and weren't really aware of what the problem was. I guess that...
Yeah, it's a definite problem. It starts right at age 5, by the way, when they go into kindergarten, that many parents feel that their obligation ended right there when they turn them over to the school people and say, hey, there he is. There that child is. Do what you have to. Discipline. Do what you want. And you can't have that. It's got to be a marriage of everybody.
I think where the legislature and law enforcement, everybody, and the courts can get together is where Well, I can only speak from personal experience in Ocean Township because we've done it. We had a program when I was in the youth division and before and hopefully after we'd start at kindergarten. We'd go in and visit with the kids and not really talk about anything much. You know, we'd have a uniform officer and maybe a plainclothes officer, explain to them what the police do and talk to them for a couple of minutes. And I think that type of community-oriented policing, which has to go, I think, all the way from kindergarten right through to at least 12th grade, because we'd go to the high school also and make ourselves available to seniors, juniors, sometimes freshmen, sophomore, in the school, just go into their class, their family living class, and say, here we are, what do you want to know?
And you know, you can never start down too low. Don't ever think for a second that those K1, 2, 3 kids don't know what they're talking about.
They certainly
because
do. Some of the questions that
they do know. Too often they start these drug programs, you know, up in the 9th, 10th, 11th. And let me tell you something.
It's too late.
You've got to go down further into these elementary schools.
Yeah, and I feel pretty good about the way we've handled that locally, and I think it's spreading out. People are all the time looking at the types of programs. And we were lucky enough in Ocean to be recognized by the president for our excellence in drug abuse services. But I think there's something that we're talking about that actually it's a program. We don't really have the money to do it. I wish we had more manpower to put in the schools more. And funding obviously is a problem where our budget is like tighter than anything. Are we going to see any of these programs coming back, you think? Or are we going to continue are they going to get lost? Or are you going to jump up and down and hopefully make them stop listening?
I just feel that it's a shame, but a lot of them are going to be lost, Kevin. I don't want to give people false hope out there, but the bottom line is trying to maintain a staff, really. You see, and that's what's happened recently with the legislation that Dan and I opposed was the fact that it's going to cut into programs in schools. It has to. It has to cut in. If it's not today or tomorrow, within the next year, not maybe this coming September, the following September, you are going to see programs that are going to be cut. It's a shame those type of programs are the first ones to go.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen enough cuts in the school area. Moving on to even other areas, the environment, Dan, I know you have a very strong feeling about that. How do you think the enforcement effort's going as far as what legislation we have in place now?
Well, we have some new, it's interesting, I was going to lead from education into the environment because one of the important things I think that is starting to be undertaken in our schools is environmental education of our youth. Because I think for the coming generations, we have to have environmental sensitivity, and that way we'll have strong environmental laws. We'll have a society that's much more conditioned to protect our environment. And as far as the enforcement goes, we have some new laws on the books. We have a Clean Water Enforcement Act that was enacted in the beginning of this session, which should do quite a bit to give us cleaner water, and we have been fairly successful on the shore. But I think that the big issue that's coming up in the state, and I'm on the Solid Waste Management Committee, is the solid waste issue. As many people know, there's a very controversial proposal for a solid waste incinerator in Monmouth County, which is something that I've come out very strongly against. And in fact, I'm sponsoring legislation to place a moratorium on additional solid waste incinerators in New Jersey, because the whole idea here, the whole concept is that recycling, source reduction, methods to reduce the solid waste stream should be the first resort of our solid waste policy, and incineration should be the last resort. I think the past decade, or more like the past 6 years, that's been reversed, and I think that was backwards. And I think that is very critical, and that goes into environmental education. We were all taught from a young age that you can just throw away, you can use as much packaging material as you want. Now I think we're starting to realize, as our landfills are filled to capacity and as people are starting to be very concerned and scared of incineration, that we have to stop that. We have to change our habits. And it's interesting, with education, in front of our solid waste committee, we just had a group of high school students in who had drafted a law to require recycling in high schools. And it was an excellent law, and they were from all over the state. In fact, I think they did it at the governor's school in Monmouth College. Yeah. And they were very articulate and very effective. We passed the bill out of the committee, and that's the type of thing that you want to see. And that's where education and environmental concerns really intersect.
See, education Dan's right, is really what it's all about. When I went to school, believe me, we never heard of the word environment. We never knew how to spell it either, but we never even heard of the word. Honestly, you didn't. Nobody had lessons in those things, but at least now our kids are cognizant of the words about the ozone layer and the environment and the clean water and what's the testing show, you know, and we're doing these things now. And maybe we haven't reached the pinnacle where we should be, but I really believe we're making a dent into the environment now where people are thinking clean environment, and they got to think about the world too, environment, and not just local, just right here or right in New Jersey.